During my time as a pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church, I was in an ongoing conversation about the relationship between LGBTQ folks and local churches. And over the years, regardless of all the different kinds of settings in which that conversation was happening, it kept bringing me back to this very particular biblical imagery. Moses and his people on the edge of a body of water that they could not safely cross, with the armies of Egypt bearing down on them from behind. An impossibility. Any change necessary for a peaceful, free future was just off the table. Something very new. Something not just unprecedented, but unexpected and very unlikely would need to happen. It has pretty much always felt that same way to me in the institutional conversation about sexuality and gender and identity and communal religious practice. That any change necessary in order for a peaceful, connected, communal future to be possible just seemed off the table. For that reason, and for several others, I've turned my attention to places in which I saw actual newness. And that was almost always in relationship. It was almost always happening on a level that the institutional conversation was too busy or too noisy to notice. But as quiet as some of those spaces and moments might have been, they continue to grant me deep and sincere hope for a future I can't see yet. Staci Frenes' story is one of those spaces and places, and it was a joy to reconnect with her in conversation. Check it out. You are what, 27 minutes or so south from me still? What town are you in now?
I'm in Brentwood, yeah. So
so you're more east than you're in Brentwood.
Where are you?
Well, I'm in Martinez.
Okay, so I'm east. Yeah.
Yeah. Way out
Brentwood.
There. How long have you been in Brentwood now?
We have been out here for, I'd say, about almost 20 years now.
Oh, okay.
Which seems to just fly, but yeah, it truly.
Yes. Because I don't place you in Brentwood. Mm-hmm. Although I don't know that I place
anyone anywhere
in Brentwood. No, Brentwood specifically is one of those towns. Is like, do people really live there?
Do people live there?
Is that a real thing? I place you in like closer to the Silicon Valley, like down 680, Tri-City area, like just the northern part of Silicon Valley.
That's funny. Well, I did a lot of singing there when I think when you and I were crossing paths a lot. I was singing in the North Bay or in the South Bay a lot, and I think when I was in Alameda for a long time before I moved here out here. So that was that's where it feels like home, sort of more.
Alameda does.
Yeah, I mean that part of the Bay Area. Yeah, Brentwood never feels like home. It just feels like, oh, what are we doing out here? You know,
yes.
We just
well, that's like I crack wise about it. Like I'm joking to some degree, but I'm fascinated by place. And Brentwood really is one of those towns in which and there are numbers of towns that are this way. But like I don't know who actually feels at home. Like they'll call it like it's where they live and they have their people there. But I just don't. Brentwood's one of those towns that, like, if you run into someone on the other side of the country, they don't claim Brentwood. They're not like, "Yep, Brentwood's my spot."
Totally.
It's like, no, we have a place in Brentwood, or whatever. For you,
or you just say, I just say San Francisco Bay Area. I just kind of pull that whole thing out of the hat, you know.
Alameda still feels like home. Why?
Somewhat. I mean, I think just because I moved there. I mean, I was born and raised in North Dakota until I was 13. So I'm a Midwesterner girl. But then Alameda was where I came of age, you know, from age 13 to age 25-ish or whatever. That's where my most formative years were. And just like, you know, you go back to talking about place, you know, you go back to places that just feel viscerally like full of memory and the profound memories, the ones that impress, you know, forever, I think. So yeah, but then also really I also do a lot of traveling to Nashville. I now have a sister and a mom in Nashville, as well as, so I feel like that feels homey to me too. And we may be relocating at some point fairly soon to Nashville.
which is another one of those towns that maybe more so. I was just in Nashville recently. It's a place I visit more so now, but it's a place in which people would feel like they had work to do, they had relationships there, but for very few people did it feel like home because of the nature. It's changed over time, and it is a place where folks feel more like they actually have roots. Why go back to Nashville?
I think because of my family. They're my only remaining family, my mom and my sister, and my mom's getting up in years. And so it's like, I just want to help. I want to be there. Yeah. For my mom in her last final years. Yeah.
That is the thing, man. It really, talk about the thing that happens all of a sudden. Looking up and thinking about the last few years of a parent's life.
Well, you don't see them coming. I mean, Abe's mom died 2 months ago, and she was sick for years, but it still came, the final days came very quickly, and you're just not prepared for it. And yet there's also though, there's like this big season of life that you sort of find yourself in that you're like, oh, here we are.
Speaking of, before we're going to talk about the book and talk about the ethos of the book and the impetus for the thing. But writing a book, this is your third book?
It's second.
Second book. You did a devotional thing as well, though. There was like a book, and then there was like a devotional thing you were part of. Am I getting that right? Because I have 3 books in my mind with your name on them.
Yeah, I no, I mean, I authored Flourish. I'm trying to think if there was anything else I contributed to devotional wise. I may have, and it's blanking on me, but not really. No.
Does it feel like full book. Does it still feel like a new art form for you, book writing? Because after years of making music, which is you can do it in your sleep, it's more secondhand, it's more second nature. Does book writing feel like a new thing, or does it feel more like? Well, talk about the relationship between like musician, author, that work and expression. Is it more of a slog? Is it harder? Is it refreshing? Like, what's that like for you?
I think. Well, a couple of things come to mind. One is that in recent years, I've started doing some freelance editing, and so I've been coming at book writing from that point of view, from critiquing it, from other people writing, and that's been really. I really have enjoyed that, and I think it's helped me approach the craft of it not so personally, and
that's really good.
That's been really helpful. Yeah. So that when I did sit down to actually start my book, which was now 5 years ago that I started writing it, I had a little bit of perspective and distance from the craft, and that was helpful for me. But I still got my ass kicked by my developmental editor for this last book. Like, it was amazing.
Which makes sense. Again, we'll get really deep into the heart of the book, but like it really makes sense with your subject matter that you really don't want to give people a reason to stop reading, or like it really needs to be a little bit more refined as a piece.
It did. It came out as a total emotional dump, the first time, and it was just therapy for me to write it. And then she kind of came back to me and said, "This is great. So now can you write it for people who want to read it?"
Yes. I coach my artists in general this direction, that part of what keeps us from finishing things is that we're too emotionally attached to them. And I'm never going to say like don't emotionally invest in your work. You absolutely should. But in order to finish a work, you really do have to have some altitude on it. And so I'll talk about like your favorite artist, whoever your favorite artist is. So I'll talk about like Tom Petty, like he's probably one of my favorite songwriters, right? So I can listen to a Tom Petty song and then listen to another Tom Petty song, and I'd be like, this one's better, and I like this one better. And then there's songs even on the album Wildflowers, which is a damn near perfect record.
Yes.
I'd be like, yeah, this song's a weaker song on the record. Like I have the altitude from that, and to be able to get that personally. Where like to listen to my own stuff or to read my own stuff and be like, this isn't that great. I have like the practice you just talked about, like actually being in that editing mode helps to rescue me from like the odd gravitational, emotive clingingness.
Oh my gosh.
That I have to my own work. It keeps me from finishing.
Oh, for sure. Which is why the War of Art changed my life. His whole thing about being both boxer and trainer, was so
it's such a
good. Yeah.
This was, like you said, more of an emotional dump. You didn't want to make a record about this because the conversation in your own soul was a little more nuanced. Songs tend to have a little bit more focus and finality to them. Did you set out to, was this just a matter of like, hey, I need to process somewhere and maybe it'll become a thing? Or was this like, this is a journey? I'm just using the word just because it's funny at this point. This is a journey I know I'm going to go on, and I know I'm going to take people with me. Were you conscious of this becoming an artifact at some point that would be like a piece of the public conversation about queer kids and religious culture? Did you know that was going to happen?
I think that revelation sort of hit me about halfway through the process. It didn't hit me in the beginning. In the beginning, it really was just like almost an outgrowth of a blog post kind of thing, sort of like I actually posted a blog in 2015 when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of gay marriage. I decided to sort of come out myself publicly about what I believed and how I'd moved to an affirming position. And, that blog post just kind of went as viral as anything I've ever done. And it was to me, that was the impetus to sit down and start really writing out the story. And it was about halfway through that process that and I'm going to tell you something, I don't think I've ever said this yet in talking about the book, and it's going to sound really woo-woo and out there, but it really did happen to me. Yeah, and I mean, I'm a woman who's in my 50s. I've been doing, I've put out 12 albums of original music. I've written, I've done some stuff in the ministry world. And I'm telling you, Justin, about halfway through this book, I felt this overwhelming sense of, and I'm not even sure how to explain it, but it was this like, you were born to be sitting at this desk at this moment, writing these words for this purpose, period. Everything else was just fodder for why you're here right now at this desk writing this. And I honestly have never felt that about any of my work. And this, I felt that about. It was. And I knew it wasn't even going to be about the quality of the writing or the any of that. It was just going to be, this is a moment in time for which you need to write this thing, and you're going, this tributary is going to be added to the big river, and you're part of that river.
That's very good. Quite a moment to be having. Then let's take a step back from it and talk about that moment in which you just said, I came out and shared that I was in an affirming position. I'd love for you to talk about that experience, but just before that, talk about why you wouldn't have. In other words, one of the things you get to speak to is this piece, this sort of transition piece. It's one thing to come to a social position about anything sociopolitically, anything hyper-relational, and feel differently in your skin. It really is actually an entirely different exercise spiritually, socially, emotionally, psychologically, sometimes financially, to be public about some of the things we think. Talk about like what would have kept you from saying publicly, this is where I'm coming from. And some of that might sound like obvious stuff, but for other folks, it can be a little bit freeing to be like, I vibe this. Like, is there a fear there? Like, what keeps a person? What kept you from publicly being there before then?
There were a few reasons. One of them is just that it took me a while to process it. It took me a while to get from point A to point B, and I didn't want to do that out loud in a public forum. I didn't want to be. I didn't want to think aloud about it because it was too tender of a subject for me. And by tender, I just mean it's my own daughter, my child. And so as I'm formulating thoughts and opinions and ideas, I don't want to be sort of throwing those out there. Like, I'm kind of wondering this today. And then the next day, well, maybe I was wrong about that thing. Yeah. Like, to me, that just feels very like, you can do that about some things, but I couldn't do that about this. It just felt too close to the heart. And then, and I think too, I'm, if you want to get into Enneagram stuff, which I do kind of subscribe to some of that.
We already got into the woo-woo, because we can definitely.
We did. We're there already.
Yes, we're
what
there.
are we talking
We've been
about?
There. We're in the soup now.
We live there. I live there. I'm a 4. So just blah, there it is. And so, so part of my inner workings had to do with sort of, how do I position this from an image standpoint? How do I even, like, as a Christian artist, as someone who has made my living in evangelical faith spaces, how do I suddenly just even breach this topic and begin speaking about it as though it's something it's lives inside my, my persona.
Yes.
And I didn't know how to do that like that. I was just kind of frozen. I was kind of paralyzed for a while. And part of that was a financial decision as well, because I knew the minute I began being a little bit more public about it, that the gigs, would stop coming. Yeah. And they did. I mean, I got one call and an invitation after another. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
And and so there was the fear, and then I didn't have language for it yet. It took me a long time to even like know what I was, or be able to put words to what this thing was. I was not someone who was really following any kind of progressive or deconstruction narrative or conversation online or anywhere. I was pretty like in this sort of evangelical bubble, like of my little world and my church and the churches I was singing at and speaking. And so it took me some time to just begin reading and connecting and conversing with other people who were on a similar path, that I could then begin to talk about it and find language for it.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe the direct question is, did you have a fear? Did you experience a fear? It wouldn't have been theological, it would have been like a personal fear about who God is in this. Is it part of the process for you, that if this is insofar as your daughter's gay, you used to believe that this was not a good thing at all, and now there's a thing, and then your heart starts to change and you become... Talk a little bit about, like, how was there a fear there about God being different than God was, and like the insecurity? Perhaps this is part, some people talk about this in terms of deconstruction. I don't think it has to be. Was there a fear of like losing God the way you understood God, and what happens on the other side of that? Was it more comforting to come into a different theological position, or was there no real shift and just kind of a broadening? Like, talk about what it looked like for you to be a person of faith moving through this process, and particularly being public about it.
Yeah, I do think that with Abby coming out, there was a it was that proverbial crack in the wall where I began to see water seeping through this thing that I thought was just rock solid, this thing called biblical inerrancy, or this thing called, this is God's word and God said it, I believe it, that's all that matters. And so this idea that there could be some other deeper reality than what I had been believing and reading, and immersed in all my life, it was a direct hit to my core. It wasn't just, oh, let me just sort out these few verses. It was, is God a good God? Is God, is God a good God, like I've believed all my life? Or is this some kind of huge universal cosmic joke on all of us,
In what way would it have been that?
Because a mother's heart says my child is beautiful and good and perfect, and somehow I had been grown up believing that God said certain people, including this child that now has come out as gay, oh, in fact, that child is not good and perfect. That child is broken and an abomination, and all these words and these things, these concepts that I associated with other people.
Yes.
Suddenly now it was my child. And so in that reckoning came this deep, deep fear that I had been tricked into believing in a good God. And in fact, it was the first time I ever doubted the goodness of God. because how could, I mean, this was before you asked for the before, right?
Yeah.
It
Yes,
was
ma'am.
just this whole thinking of like, how could God create human beings that he then could not love and accept and embrace and be in relationship with? Like,
Yes.
what is that?
Yeah.
And of course that then became the breaking point. That was the chink in the armor, the crack in the wall. Oh, those things are actually not even both true,
And what you find yourself up against then has more to do with hermeneutics than an experience of the divine. It has more to do with the interpretive disagreement and conclusion and the system built around that versus an actual terrifying,
yes,
life-altering encounter with the divine.
Right. And I think there's both. For me, there was both. There was kind of like at that deep level of that personal wrestling with God. And then there was the sort of there was a time when I had to just put all of that kind of on hold and go, oh, well, wait, I just need to figure out how to raise a teenager who's gay and deal with sort of the pragmatics of that on a daily level. And it was actually a lot of that lived experience, just kind of the pragmatics of it, that actually helped the deeper wrestling.
What do you talk about the pragmatics? You mean in terms of like how do I just love my kid as a pragmatic? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was it came down to little things. It came down to awkward conversations about how her friends dressed or how she felt comfortable dressing, or awkward conversations about having friends over after school and going, well, is this a friend or is this a friend you feel differently about? And, and she would roll her eyes and just, like the universal sign for you're so lame, and I'd be like, but help me understand this, 'cause I want to understand, and we would just have these conversations about what it's like to be her. She invited a girl to prom, and her senior year they went to prom, and I live in a small town, and I had sung at all the big churches in town, and everybody sort of knew. Not everybody. I'm saying, I'm just saying I couldn't go to the grocery store.
Everyone in your world, yes.
In my world, yeah.
Yes,
I couldn't go to the post office without someone going, "Hey, Staci, you sang at my church," And so I was navigating this public persona, and at the same time, just trying to be a good mom to my child, and and I think one of the things that pragmatism did, which is what it does all the time, right, is it just sort of becomes this, for me anyway, it grew into this sort of lived theology, like sort of how do you love is not really about how, finding chapter and verse. It's about how do I support this child asking a girl to the prom when everything in me is sort of in turmoil over that, but I'm crazy about her, and I want to show her that I love her and that it's okay, whatever she does. And so, you then sort of walk in love, without necessarily knowing how that all feels inside. You don't feel all settled about it, other than you just feel like, as a mom, I think somewhere in my gut, it was telling me, this is what's right. This is what's right. This is how you love.
It is, which ends up being the question, which is probably where we'll land. I want to ask a little bit about your relationship with the institutional church around you and local churches. One of the fears, one of the obstacles, like one of the actual sticking points in this conversation among our tribe of persons has to do with the ability to, the capacity to, the desire to disagree here. Can you talk a little bit about your experience over the last, 4 or 5 years now, being in conversation, being able to have questions, being able to talk through? Can you talk about your experience in relationship with the institutional church? Because part of what I part of what I admire, value, part of what makes this, I think, not just interesting, but also like helpful and refreshing, is where you're not coming from is, these people are wrong, we need to burn it down. Where you're coming from is like, I had to change in order to love well. and you can too.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about what that's looked like for you, the difficulty of it, victories. What's it look like for you to maintain a relationship with the institutional church over the course of the last 4 or 5 years?
Well, I don't know that I've done a great job of that. I don't know that I can tell you today that I have a really healthy relationship with the church, and that's, big C as well as my own local body. Um, it's been really, really complicated, and I, I'm, some of that is because um, I've come up against policies that have felt really uncomfortable to me, and to someone who has an LGBTQ person in their family. There came a point for me anyway that I couldn't keep going to the same church and standing, next to people who were worshiping and singing to the same God, but who I knew for a fact couldn't pray the same prayers for my child, and or wish the same well-being for my child that they wanted for their own child. And that becomes it becomes really like a deal breaker, for it has for me anyway. And yet, in personal private conversations with individual people from those places, it's been mostly good. It's been mostly really positive. It's been
Yes.
people saying, I'm really, I'm open. I'm curious. How did you land where you did? Tell me about your process. It's amazing to me that those conversations are as healthy and wonderful and open as they are.
Yes.
And yet the policies that, dictate how we treat LGBTQ people are not changing.
What's fascinating is, I've had this conversation a lot, but like even on the podcast earlier this season, I had this conversation with an earlier guest about the odd, and I guess I still do find it odd that I do understand that there are hang-ups in this conversation about like being affirming or non-affirming, about like how do you read this part of the Bible but not read the part right next to it in the same way, and how do you do how do we understand hermeneutics, and how much biological knowledge do you have to have in order to, like, I get that it's relatively complicated. I'm not unaware of that. I am fascinated by, and I'm actually dumbfounded and deeply saddened by what seems like the decision that we make to literally rip ourselves institutionally and socially to shreds over this, like, in this conversation. Because the conversation we had on the it's called the Shelter in Place podcast was that it seems inevitable that as soon as the moment a church staff and a congregation enters into an affirming church staff, a non-affirming church staff enters into a conversation about queerness, about homosexuality, that the inevitable result will be a splintering. That, like, this is just what it's like. It's gonna happen. This is the way it feels in our minds. This is the way it's communicated. It's gonna happen. That if you, and I even heard in trainings and conversations that if you enter this conversation, you are going to end up. It feels to me like this terrifyingly self-fulfilling prophecy, because in my mind I'm like, it really doesn't have to. It actually doesn't have to do that. In your experience, and that I'm preaching here in part because it literally infuriates me and I don't understand it. Why does it happen that way? Like, why is this so intractable as a conversation? Why is it so impossible to live together in disagreement institutionally as Christians around this? And I'll caveat that by saying this. We're talking about a populace of folks who, on the whole, will go to the mat, and I will too, saying that on the evidence of Scripture and history, this man was both God and man at the exact same time. that he was crucified, he was dead, then he was raised in the body, and then ascended like from death into heaven, was raised and lives in like we'll all go to the mat all for that one, and we're in. But we can't get around to having a disagreement about what comes down to like somewhere between 4 and 5 bits of text and a truckload of biological information about people we love. What the hell is going on? I don't get it. Do you?
I'm not sure that I do. I can tell you that the agree to disagree isn't going to work when you're on sort of this side of things.
Yes.
So there's the first rub. Like
Good.
It has to, like, that's why I'm having trouble going to church right now, unless it's like a full on, clearly affirming church. And I just haven't found one yet, but I feel like on every other topic, we can kind of do this agree to disagree, but on the basic, foundational sort of, dignity and worth of a human being's life, you can't, and
yeah, and I guess I'm not even going to like, let's settle on agreeing to disagreeing. Agreeing to disagree.
No.
But,
I hear you. Yeah. And so, but I think there's more parts to that. My answer was that I think there's more cultural bias that's a lot of Christians aren't copping to around this topic. So, and it's one of the things I address in my book. And it's that, I think I brought as much just cultural bias to this topic as I did religious bias and religious presuppositions. I mean,
talk about the difference for folks who might not quite grasp the gap between a religious bias and a cultural bias. Like,
sure. I mean,
dig into that for me.
So before I even became a Christian, I was a child of, the 70s and 80s and well, particularly during the 70s, you did not see any kind of great queer representation in media, television, books. It was always the gay character would either get killed off or it was some sort of caricature. And you just sort of, I grew up believing that there's obviously something really bad and really wrong with those people. And that
which
also
wasn't
had
necessarily
to do with,
emanating from a religious center. It was just
right.
in the
It was
soup
just
of
what media told me,
NBC
what images
and CBS and CNN.
Yep. I think that any kind of images that I saw on television of LGBTQ people were, and I grew up, or I came of age in the San Francisco Bay Area, where you had a really thriving, LGBTQ community. But I was raised conservative, fairly conservative, even before my family became Christians. We were just kind of conservative people. We moved to California from North Dakota, the Midwest, where just things like that weren't talked about. And my parents didn't have gay friends. I didn't have gay friends until I was in my 30s, or at least people I knew were gay.
Yes,
and and so it wasn't in the water. You know what I mean? The understanding, any kind of like nuanced like belief, or not, I mean nuanced like experience of being around gay people.
There's so little training. It's not a discipled part of the culture. Which then takes me to the part of it that and I agree with you, and I probably need to revamp the way I ask this question, because I'm not pointing at, hey, let's agree to disagree as like the baseline, that's the landing place, because then we do end up dehumanizing people. I guess I also mean, and there's a comic, I think, in which it was the 2 frames in this comic, this single strip, and the one is someone who looks like me, a white man, in a church on his knees praying, God, send us more people, fill this place with your people. And then the next frame is a bunch of folks in rainbow gear, like this is the denotation that these are queer folks, these LGBTQ folks, And he's like, no, not those ones.
Right. I think I've seen that. Yeah.
Right. So the what keeps a set of eyes from seeing this as this moment as a work of the Spirit of God? Like, what keeps us from recognizing that this is a thing that God is up to, a conversation that's not just that we're not getting attacked by the culture or whatever the hell people mean when they say that.
Yeah.
This isn't the liberal agenda. What keeps us from saying, okay, wait, this must be a thing that God is doing. How can we be responsible to that? What keeps us from going to that place and seeking God and attention as opposed to just trying to resolve it with policy? Why does that not happen?
I know for myself it was, and it seems like that the people that I pay attention to who are the most resistant, there is just this real either unwillingness or inability to accept that perhaps the Bible is not the kind of text that we may think it is. That if you, and what I mean by that is, if you admit that a few verses have been really poorly translated and thus sort of weaponized against an entire community of people, which I do believe the clobber verses have been and are, then, oh my goodness, then what else maybe have we gotten wrong about the Bible? What else is there in it that we may need to examine in ourselves and in one another? So I think that it's
the chink in the armor thing from the other side. Like, for you, the chink in the armor was this personal relationship and that you had with God that was all of a sudden thrown into question. Like, can God be good? Then that question was the chink in the armor. You're saying the other side of the coin is the chink in the armor would be like, if I start to question this, what else do I have to question? And is it everything?
Yeah. And I'm not, here's like someone speaking from sort of a non-affirming place is going to say, I think, I'm going to fight all the way down. I've been in countless conversations with people who have studied harder than I have and are more convinced of their position about a gay person than I am, maybe even, who are simply unwilling to admit that perhaps the Bible meant that perhaps there's a translational issue here that we all got tripped up on.
Yeah.
And I don't even know how to. I get to a certain point with someone like that and go, I clearly, you holding to the truth is more important than you considering the human beings who are being hurt by this vice grip you've got on the truth.
And you're using air quotes when you say the truth, which was I'm pointing out to the folks.
Yeah.
Part of what I'm hearing you get to, which is and this is a place where you and I really resonate, is I don't even know exactly how to say this. I wrote a piece a little while ago about this odd. It has to do with like the grip we have on reality and truth by way of hermeneutics, as if the goal somehow was to get it right, get things right.
Right.
And I really honestly do wonder at times. This is very, very real, and this is where I get woo-woo. Is like the oddity and the difficulty, the impactable, what's the word? Like the intractable nature. I'll look this word up and I'll fix it in editing. But like the impossibility of this, the stuckness of this conversation, really does feel. The image in my mind is something along the lines of this, just the darkness, just blackness, like not blackness, but darkness.
Yeah.
Like a mist. Like, why can't you see?
Yeah.
And the question ends up being like, the thing that I don't see is you. The thing that I lack.
Yeah.
I want to come to a conclusion that makes me feel. I want to come to a conclusion about a particular reality or a particular, small t truth that allows me then to have a relationship with you. which I feel more comfortable about my relationship with you. And I wonder if there really is, in the way that, you know, like some of those confounding bits of scripture in which you know, the earlier writers would say that God blinded someone, that God kept them from seeing, or God hardened someone's hearts. It would make sense to me, and I'm not saying this is what's happening. It would make sense to me if their honest to God was like a massive spiritual blindness here, that was in a sense. Oh gosh, you know, I'm getting myself in all kinds of trouble. You don't get to come to conclusions until you're in love with people. That this is the thing. Like you don't see this straight.
Yes.
Boy, that's a funny way to say this. You don't get to see this correctly. You do see this straight. You don't get to see correctly. You don't get to see clearly unless you're willing to be in love. And in fact, it is only on the other side of actually being in love with people that you get to see this truth. That makes some sense to me. Like why this is as absolutely impossible for us culturally. And it's by us, I literally mean people like me. Straight, white men in their 40s and 50s, maybe in their 60s, who have massive controls over churches and church communities, who are also lamenting the massive decline in religious interest and church attendance. I'm talking to me. The impossibility of this. What if the whole ball game is actually more, and this is why I love your book, and it's why I love you doing this the way you're doing it. What if the whole ball game really is like, I'm so sorry, I know you want to feel comfortable with your conclusions before you enter that room, but you don't get to. You just have to go in the room. You have to go in the room, and you have to actually fall in love with the people who are there. And once you have done that, once you have fallen in love with the people there, I will open your eyes to see things a little bit more clearly. But I'm not going to play the game of you feeling like you get to get it right and then walk into the room in a position of control.
I think that's right on. I think that's right on. Yeah. And I think coming about this, you know, from any other angle is it's just going to, you know, bam, 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 because the more I try to argue my biblical interpretation versus your biblical interpretation, you're absolutely right. We will walk away having felt like we did our best with the armor we were wearing, and we never saw each other. And I think that, you know, I say that all the time, Justin. I say, you know, before my daughter came out, I had this luxury of just like thinking about this topic and then setting it on a shelf for a while and deciding if I want to think about it again the next time it comes up in my Facebook feed or my Instagram feed, or the next time it comes up in conversation. But I didn't live with it. I didn't have to live with it. And until it, and
there had to be a wound. There had to be a personal grief in it. It's that, I mean, it's such a terrible analogy, but I'm going to use it anyways because it's my podcast. It's the moment. It's the moment in Dark Knight Rises. It's a Batman reference. It's a moment in Dark Knight Rises when Bruce Wayne is Batman, just for the record, where he's been beaten down and he's in the bottom of this pit. And he's tried to climb out a couple times, and he ends up injured. And the doctor eventually says to him, "You're just not afraid enough. You're not scared. Like it doesn't matter enough to you. This is why you can't make that jump, because you're not scared enough. Like you might have you probably have the physical wherewithal. You don't want it bad enough." Yeah. It's almost as if we have not embraced our own woundedness here. That it's not a matter of like there are gay kids over there and someday we'll figure this conversation out. It's like, no, the body is broken because those are your freaking kids and they don't like being at home.
Yeah.
Like if you're the church you want to be, those kids should feel like they can come home to you. They don't. You should feel sad. And until you're sad, there's no conversation to be had. Until you're sad that it's broken this way, we don't get to talk about making it right.
That's really, 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 really true. I really feel that.
Well, your book does a job of forging a pathway through, like, into sadness and grief, without just leaving people there. That like, hey, this sucks, because that's easy. That's the easy part of cultural critique. Is like, hey, this sucks. Just like the easy part of cultural critique is to be like, you suck.
Right.
And you don't do that. you walk through your own grief. You also don't make it just like a personal memoir, or like this is just my story. This is a story you're in that you have experienced personally. It makes it powerful. I think it makes it really cultural, historical moment, really appropriate. And it really specifically cracks doors open, kicks doors down, that if you're Semler and you're writing music from a queer perspective about being a Christian, they won't get access to the kinds of folks that you will have access to,
right?
Who are white moms in their 50s and 60s,
right?
Who are, but let's be completely honest, who have been for the last 20 years the actual social glue that has held together the white Western Evangelical Church. Are freaking moms between the age of 30 and 63 anyways.
Exactly.
They've literally held the thing together.
We're here. We're here. It's so true. And it's like I can't even tell you, Justin, that those are the exact direct messages and texts and emails I get every single day from those people, because and one of the things I set out to do in this book was to, because you have, like you said, you have your sort of Christian testimonial. I once was this, now I'm this. Woo, praise Jesus.
Yes.
But I was more about, hold on, let's talk about what happens in that space between when you're really in that place of moving from that to this.
Yes.
Because I felt like that's where the work is, but then that's also where I couldn't find that book when I was looking. I couldn't find it. I found people who were already way further ahead than me, and I found people who were just in a different, who landed in a different place. I wanted to get there. I didn't know how, and I feel like I that's what I tried to write, was how to get there.
That's good. Well, thanks for writing it. Thanks for spending some time with me.
Oh, thank you for having me. I love it.
Excellent. And thank you for listening to this episode of the At Sea podcast. If you would like to follow up with Staci Frenes, find out what she's up to with the book, another book she's got coming out, her music, you can visit her at stacifrenes.com. Staci spelled with an I, and Frenes is Frenes, stacifrenes.com. On the other hand, if you would as well like to be part of the small army of folks who make this podcast possible, you can visit us at patreon.com/Justin McRoberts. Pitch in at $3, jump in at $20, wherever you want to come in. We would love to have you on the team. Until next time.